The Israel-Sudan Normalization Agreement is an agreement that took place on October 23, 2020, whereby Israel and Sudan agreed that they will normalize relations. It is not clear if the deal establishes full diplomatic relations between the two nations. According to Axios reporting on March 10, 2021, while Israel has presented Sudan with a draft agreement for establishing diplomatic relations, the Sudanese want an endorsement from the Biden administration. The agreement came after the agreements of Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates signed with Israel in September 2020. Unlike the latter two, Sudan had sent troops to fight against Israel in major Arab-Israeli wars and considered Israel an enemy state. The Sudanese authorities are discussing the cancellation of a 1958 law forbidding establishing relations with Israel, and outlawing business with citizens of Israel as well as business relationships with Israeli companies or companies with Israeli interests. The law also forbids the direct or indirect import of any Israeli goods. Sudan is one of the Arab countries that fought wars with Israel, and its capital, Khartoum, witnessed the adoption of an Arab League resolution known as the Resolution of the Three No's. No peace, no recognition, no negotiations. Sudan had sent troops to fight the Israeli forces in all Arab-Israeli major wars and considers Israel an enemy state. Moreover, it was claimed that the Israeli Air Force attacked Sudanese forces and terrorists taking cover in Sudan in 2009 and 2012. In early January 2016, Sudanese Foreign Minister Ibrahim Ghandor and President Omar al-Bashir floated normalized ties with Israel provided the U.S. government lifted economic sanctions. Early September 2016 was revealed that Israel had contacted the U.S. government and other Western countries and encouraged them to take steps to improve relations with Sudan in the wake of the break in relations between the Arab African country and Iran in the prior year. In February 2020, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the chairman of the Sovereignty Council of Sudan, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, met in Uganda, where they agreed to normalize the ties between the two countries. Later that month, Israeli planes were allowed to fly over Sudan. In May 2020, Israel flew medics and equipment to Sudan to try and save a Sudanese diplomat, Najwa Gadha Aldam, who managed to arrange the aforementioned meeting in Uganda as she worked as a political advisor to the president of Uganda Yoweri Museveni, when she was infected and later died from COVID-19. In August 2020, the U.S. Secretary of State toured several Arab League countries, including Sudan. On September 15, 2020, UAE and Bahrain signed with Israel the Abraham Accords and thus became the first Arab country to sign a peace deal with Israel since Jordan in 1994. Mauritania recognized Israel in 1999 but cut ties 10 years later. It was reported that Sudan and Oman were also expected to sign the accords after the U.S. elections. On October 19, 2020, President Trump tweeted that he would remove Sudan from the list of countries it considers state sponsors of terrorism as soon as its government had deposited $335 million in promised compensation for victims of the bombings of the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998 and the USS Cole in 2000. And on October 22, Sudan's information minister said Thursday that the money had been deposited. Sudan had hosted Osama bin Laden in Khartoum between 1991 and 1996. In mid-October 2020, Sudanese businessman Abu al-Qasim Bottom visited Israel to accelerate the normalization process. On October 22, 2020, an Israeli delegation visited Sudan, where they met with Abdel Fattah al-Burhan for talks on the normalization of ties between the two countries. On October 23, 2020, Israel and Sudan agreed to a deal to normalize ties. President Trump, Sudanese chairman of the Sovereignty Council Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, Sudanese Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu took part in a conference call on October 23 and subsequently announced the agreement. Sudan's acting foreign minister said on October 23 on state TV that Sudan's agreement will depend on approval from its yet-to-be-formed Legislative Council. A joint statement issued by the governments of Israel, Sudan, and the United States said that the leaders agreed to the normalization of relations between Sudan and Israel and to end the state of belligerence between their nations. It went on to state that, in addition, the leaders agreed to begin economic and trade relations with an initial focus on agriculture. The statement also suggested the possibility of further meetings and agreements, saying that the leaders also agreed that delegations will meet in the coming weeks to negotiate agreements of cooperation in those areas as well as in agriculture, technology, aviation, migration issues and other areas for the benefit of the two peoples. The Sudanese Gov.